thanks for joining us. The webinar is about leveraging cyber insurance to mitigate data breach risk, and we're going to be talking about qualification, remediation, and policy selection. I'm here today with Trevor Horowitz with TrustNet, and I'm going to let Trevor introduce himself. Trevor?
Hi, Christine. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great. Well, welcome, everyone. Thank you to all the attendees. Thank you for being part of this presentation. Just a little bit about myself. I've been in the information security field for more than 20 years. I was born in South Africa. That's where the accent is from. I'm currently the Chief Information Security Officer for TrustNet. We are an IT security and compliance services company. I've been involved in PCI compliance and data breach investigations, as I said, for the last 20 years.
Okay, thanks, Trevor. I'm president of Cyber Data Risk Managers and have been in the insurance industry for probably about 20 years now, and have been focusing in on cyber and data breach insurance for the past 5 years now. And we're located in the Princeton, New Jersey, New York area. And I'm excited to be here with Trevor today. In partnership with my underwriting partners and insurance carriers, we assist clients of all sizes, sectors, and industries. And with our extensive experience, we save our clients time, money, and headaches by helping align your complex cyber risks with the appropriate cyber insurance coverages that are offered today. Today, there's probably about 50 insurance carriers writing in this space. So that's where we come in, and we know where to place our clients with the appropriate coverages, and especially looking at your industry, knowing which carriers to go to. And I'm going to let Trevor talk a little bit about his company. Trevor?
Thank you, Christine. TrustNet helps businesses build trusted relationships with their customers and partners and employees by providing IT security compliance services and products. We are one of a handful of qualified security assessors servicing the U.S. market. We also have specialties in HIPAA compliance, FISMA, Sarbanes-Oxley, and we also do SOC, also known as SSA 16 assessments. The company was founded in 2003, and we're based in Atlanta, Georgia, and we primarily service mid-sized and large organizations, be it private or public organizations, across a wide spectrum of industries, everything from manufacturing to telecommunications, retail clients, and the like.
Thanks, Trevor. And I'm also excited that this webinar is we're able to have Trevor, who is a CISO, and talk about how you're able to assess your cyber risks in the first place, because with cyber insurance, it's all about security first and then insurance next. So we're able to ask Trevor questions in the end and really use his expert knowledge in security and how it works with insurance. So thanks, Trevor. Okay, in this afternoon's webinar, for the next 50 minutes, we're going to be talking about what cyber insurance is and what it's not, how you can determine if you need cyber insurance, what types of coverages your company might need, and ultimately how to prepare for cyber insurance and reduce costs. And if you've been hacked and you don't know it yet, that's when it's time to really be proactive today and have a plan B in the first place. So when an event happens, you're prepared. Trevor, you want to talk about this slide?
Well, this is one of my favorite Dilbert cartoons, talking about his disaster recovery plan, screaming, help, help, help. And the title of today's presentation, talking about Plan B, is exactly this. Too few organizations are planning for what to do in the event of a data breach. There's a huge increase in the number of incidents as borne out in the newspaper headlines. We're seeing hackers from all different parts of the world targeting U.S. businesses primarily in order to take valuable data. And we'll talk a little bit about what that data involves and what's valuable as part of the presentation as well. But really, your plan B is this is what happens after you've already had a breach. But there's certainly things that you can do before this to prevent a breach. But having cyber insurance, we believe, is a smart strategy to protect yourself and to mitigate risk. And we'll talk about how that fits into the whole risk mitigation approach during the presentation.
Great. Thanks, Trevor. Okay, I'm going to be talking a little bit about how your company can determine whether or not it needs cyber insurance. These are some good questions to consider. First one being, does your company collect, process, store, or have access to sensitive information? When I'm talking about sensitive information, we're talking about non-public information, such as PII, which is personally identifiable information, which is really name, address, date of birth, social security numbers, banking account information, sort of information that's non-public. And then you have PHI, which is also personal health information, medical information, payment card holder data, your credit cards, and your company might be holding on to some third-party confidential corporate data. So if your company's collecting, processing, storing, or even you might not have this data, but perhaps you're working with a larger organization in which you're accessing their network and using that data, then right off the bat, you probably should explore cyber insurance. If your company has third-party vendor relationships, another important reason why you should have a cyber insurance policy in place. Target's data breach started at a third-party vendor's location. So again, your company might not be collecting or storing data, but if you're processing it for another organization, then you should explore the purchase of a cyber insurance policy. A lot of my clients come to us because of contract requirements where they're working with an organization like Target, and Target's requiring them to hold a cyber insurance policy. So it's becoming pretty typical in the industry to have cyber insurance when you're working with a third party. And another one is, does your company operate in a regulated industry? With healthcare in particular, you're subject to HIPAA, privacy laws. If your company had a breach today, what you really want to understand and ask yourself is, could it sustain and pay for these breach costs and damages out of pocket? Breaches are expensive. The costs add up pretty quickly. So if you had a breach today, could you immediately start writing out checks for all the different expenses that come into play? This slide I'm going to pass over to Trevor.
Thanks, Christine. This slide really talks about cybersecurity risk assessment, and this is one of our recommendations for organizations who are contemplating taking out cyber insurance. Cyber insurance is very useful, but it's there to serve a specific purpose, which is to mitigate the risk associated with the breach. But there's a lot of things you need to do before you even get to that point. Firstly, this methodology goes through looking at all your assets, hardware, software, data, people, and then looking at threats, what sort of threats your industry may face, you as an organization. There's multiple different sources where you can find this data on threat identification. And then look internally in terms of your vulnerabilities, and that involves testing your environment. You know, how easy it is to break into the environment, and what sort of tools you have in place. And then comes the next component, which is to do the risk assessment itself. And that is made up of a number of different elements, looking at the likelihood, looking at impact, and then developing a risk factor. Now, some of this risk, when you get to the risk assessment, can be mitigated by adding on additional controls. And that's often something that we go and help clients do. Say, for example, they feel that we feel that their web presence is maybe vulnerable. We may go and put a web application firewall or additional security procedures. And then after that really comes in saying, well, let's balance off the risk factors associated with spending money on that technology versus what we could do otherwise, and that's where cyber insurance comes into play. Now, it's true for every cyber risk assessment that we've ever done, and probably one that will ever be done. It's impossible to completely eliminate risk just by its nature of cybersecurity and the fact that you need these tools and these websites and these access to the world or to select partners. You always have an element of risk. And again, that's where the cyber insurance, we feel, plays an important part in bridging that gap. Christine?
Thank you, Trevor. So what is cyber insurance? First of all, cyber insurance protects against losses caused by unauthorized or criminal activity coming from external sources that may be lurking in internet connections, software, and or data hosting platforms, which would be the cloud, computer systems, networks, and devices. So they were all interconnected in so many countless ways that there's just so many endpoints that could be breached and exposed. Cyber insurance is data theft, loss, network intrusions, information security breaches, lost income because of system downtime. These and more are the types of losses that a cyber insurance policy will typically cover. Here's a list. I'm really going to go into a little bit more detail in the upcoming slides about these types of coverages. Again, policies vary greatly due to the over 50 standalone cyber insurance carriers. The way cyber insurance is broken down, it's including first and third party coverages, really depending on the policy you're selecting. Coverage for security and privacy liability, breach response, privacy regulatory defense and penalties, multimedia liability, network asset protection, cyber extortion, and in some instances, cyber terrorism.
Christine, one of the things we see in our environment is insiders who are doing malicious activity. People either stealing valuable data from the company itself or somehow aiding and abetting outsiders to hack into the environment. Where does that play in terms of coverage?
Sure, you're talking about the insider activity, the malicious behavior of employees?
Yes.
Yes, that's also covered too, because as you know, we have things that could happen internally within an organization, and of course you've got the external types of attacks that are happening. So cyber insurance does cover the employees who are going behind the corporate executive suite's knowledge and doing these types of things that then put the company on the line for unauthorized activity, which then ends up in a data breach. So cyber insurance is also meant to cover incidents like that. Here, we're going to look at cyber and privacy liability. In this instance, coverage is provided for the insured, which is the policyholder's liability arising from a security breach. And that example that I just explained to Trevor, the insider employee who's acting without the knowledge of you, that type of instance is covered. And also negligence by the insured, your company, a violation of a privacy or consumer data protection law. Again, when I mentioned regulated industries, if you're in one of those, you're subject to these types of laws. And breach of contract, which oftentimes it can mean a merchant services agreement relating to the payment card industry, which is the payment card industry data security standards, that if you're processing credit card information, you're subject to those security laws. In breach response, this is typically the biggest piece of a cyber insurance policy that companies look for when they're purchasing coverage. What happens to the company after a breach? Trevor, did you want to go into this a little bit here?
Sure. So this is something that happens frequently, of course, as I said before. So cyber hacking is something we're seeing in the news more and more. And there's a number of different phases that would happen after a breach. The first phase that happens is containment. And this is a way either the organization themselves or with assistance from third-party cybersecurity experts would actually go and stop the attack or at least reduce the attack's efficacy. And that's obviously an important step. Basically, got to stop the contagion. Once that happens and the organization has buttoned things down and they're sure they're not continuing to being hacked, then starts the damage assessment. You look at different log files and log data to assess, what did the hackers, when did the hackers get in, how did they get in, what vectors did they use, and then do a complete investigation and identify the data types. So what sort of data did they get? Was it one record out of a database or was it 10,000? A very important step because that can have a huge impact down the road in terms of what the remediation costs are going to be. If you cannot identify what data was taken, you have to assume everything was taken. So that obviously can be very expensive. The next phase is obviously remediation, where you go through, patch those vulnerabilities, go through and implement new security policies and procedures, or otherwise prevent this from reoccurring. And then comes the final step, which is really recovery, and that's getting the systems back up and running, reinstalling software, and restoring lost data. A big part of this recovery process, and something that's not mentioned there, is also how you're dealing with consumers and business partners, repairing relationships, in fact. So this is again where the damage assessment becomes very important up front. For a breach of consumer information, that may, one of the remediation items and the recovery items may mean paying for ongoing credit monitoring. And that obviously has a cost associated with it. So that's where your damage assessment becomes very important, because if you can identify the exact number of records that were taken, the exact number of social security numbers or payment cards, you can address that in that fashion. If you can't identify it, you pretty much have to provide that service, that remediation service or credit monitoring to your entire universe of customers. So it becomes very critical. And being prepared for something like this is very, very important, having the right log data. And having good log data and having good forensic tools inside the organization is built into almost every industry standard today. Thank you, Christine.
Thanks, Trevor. And Trevor, I'm curious to just talk about the current landscape of things right now. As you know, we read the daily headlines every single day, and just before I read something about CareFirst experiencing a breach of, I think, 1.2 million medical subscribers. And with all the things happening, I mean, what's the latest thing that you're seeing? How are these data breaches happening? What's typically the cause of like a CareFirst? Was that like a malicious type of virus or a denial of service attack? What are you seeing right now in the landscape that's typically happening?
Well, actually, the vast majority of attacks today that are being initiated through some sort of user error. For example, a phishing attack where an email is sent to an employee and asking them for certain non-private or confidential information, and they're spoofing the email address of the sender. So in other words, spoofing is where you fake an identity. So for example, you get an email and it comes from your CEO and it says, hey, I need this urgent piece of information, or I need you to do a bank transfer from one entity to another. And if you're the controller and you get it from the CEO, you assume, well, that's the authority you need. So we're seeing a lot of that sort of thing where not only are people perpetrating fraud through phishing attacks, but they're also gathering credentials, user IDs and passwords, and then initiating the attack further on. So these attacks are very sophisticated. Organized crime is behind a lot of these attacks. It's big business. They have 50, 60, sometimes 100 people working on these projects, sometimes for 6 months or a year in advance. It's very targeted. There's a lot of money at stake. It's a lot of sophistication that's going into these attacks.
Thank you. And I also think inexperienced hackers today, too, are still a threat with. Someone could just pick up a malware toolkit. Next thing you know, they're in business of being a hacker. So between the sophisticated attacks that we're seeing from nation states and the inexperienced types of attacks, I think that these aren't going away. It's only becoming more complex and ongoing, which is why security is so important, and then mitigating, that lingering risk, with cyber insurance.
Absolutely.
Okay. Having a little bit of a technology glitch here, and bear with me. I'm trying to advance to the next screen, and here we go. Okay, and as I mentioned a little while ago, breach response is such a key piece of cyber insurance. Insurance coverage is offered for that breach response, and typically when a breach happens, the first thing you need to do is send out, first you want to look at a forensics investigation to determine the scope of the breach, and then if it's truly a data breach and there's been sensitive data that's been exposed, then the next step would be privacy breach responses, notifications to those affected individuals. So cyber insurance will pick up the cost to notify that individual. And with that piece, you're also going to be looking at credit monitoring, which could also be tied to a call center. And in coordination with the forensics investigation, you're also going to be working with a privacy attorney who's also known as a data breach coach. They're going to be working to look at these state laws that your company might be working within, that you have affected individuals who will have to be notified. Today, there's 47 different state privacy laws. So the privacy attorney assigned to your claim is going to be looking at that. And also coverage for public relations help, depending on your industry, and especially healthcare. There's the sensitive nature of any company's reputation is on the line today when a breach happens. So it's nice to have some kind of coverage to be able to go and hire a public relations firm to hope, that they can navigate the media for you, and also to minimize the damage to your reputation when your reputation's on the line and you're set up in the spotlight by many, and how you're responding to the breach. That's very important today. So having this coverage within your cyber insurance policy is truly a key piece, and why many companies today buy this coverage. And another big thing is a lot of regulatory action going on out there. And within a cyber insurance policy, there's coverage provided for regulatory defense costs, and depending if it's insurable by law, the penalties that could arise from a regulatory proceeding. And regulatory compensatory awards, this is the damages paid to those affected individuals. Sometimes these types of cases, they're dismissed before they even reach court, but many cases are able to proceed. And if there's a potential payout to those affected individuals, there would be coverage here under the cyber insurance policy.
Christine, I have a question on that. Would fines associated, for example, with the payment card industry, would that be covered under regulatory defense costs?
There would be a separate coverage for that within the policy, depending on whether or not that insurance carrier's policy offers coverage. There could potentially be coverage for PCI fines and penalties within the policies. So yes, it's not going to fall under regulatory, but it will fall under its own separate supplement for PCI coverage.
Okay, thank you.
Multimedia liability, this is for any types of advertising your company may be putting out there. Most policies, depending on, again, which policy it is, will offer coverage for either electronic and also print media. So here, coverage is being provided for investigations, defense costs, and civil damages arising from defamation, breach of privacy, negligence, and publication of any content, as well as infringement of intellectual property of a third party. And when I talk about intellectual property, I'm not talking about patents, but I'm talking about trademarks and copyrights. If there's infringement of that, then there would be coverage here on the multimedia liability piece. Patents and trade secrets, which is considered intellectual property, will never be covered under a cyber insurance policy. If you're concerned about infringement of a patent, then you should have a standalone intellectual property insurance policy for that. Network asset protection and business interruption coverage. This is pertaining to your network, and if it's put offline by a cyber attack and you're experiencing an outage, you're not able to access your emails, your server, your data, and you start experiencing a business loss of revenue. Typically, there's a waiting period built into the policy of usually 8 hours or more. And so what that means is your network would have to have been offline and experienced an outage due to a cybersecurity incident for a period of at least 8 hours in order to collect coverage under this policy. The coverage is being offered also for data as well. So data loss, if your backup fails and then you need to go and reconstruct your data, coverage is offered also under this piece for the data asset protection. The cyber extortion, I'm going to let Trevor talk about this piece here.
Well, cyber extortion is becoming an increasingly common cyber crime, and cyber hackers have taken advantage of a specific type of malware, and some folks may have heard of this. It's also known as ransomware. Essentially, what this malware does is it takes data on a particular system and encrypts it, and it encrypts it using a key that's only known to the hackers. And the screen that you see there on the right-hand side here, that is what it looks like. That's actually a screenshot from the CryptoLocker malware, where it locks the screen, and it essentially has got a countdown clock, and that gives you a certain period of time in order to go and pay the ransom. And the ransom can be anywhere from $150 to $300. Typically, the hackers will ask for that in some type of anonymous currency transfer, using maybe a cryptocurrency, for example, or they'll do a money order made out to cash to a particular location. And once that's paid over, then they'll provide the decryption key so that you can go and unlock your data. Extremely smart way of doing things from a hacker's point of view, and this has actually netted hackers an absolute fortune. When the CryptoLocker virus first came out, it was estimated that in the first 6 months they had netted themselves well north of $3 million. So these viruses can be extremely damaging, and often cases the fastest way to do this is actually to pay the money, to actually pay the ransom. So there's pros and cons in doing both, obviously, but if your data is locked and literally you're encrypted, there's literally could take you a decade to decrypt the data using very fancy tools. So this becomes a big issue for a lot of organizations. Now, a lot of people would say, well, I have backups, and this virus has been known to be so sophisticated to actually go and encrypt backup data as well. So depending on how the environment was set up, it could be extremely damaging. We've seen this virus attacking both desktops, when we've seen it attacking servers as well. It's actually gone in and encrypted servers. So something to be extremely concerned about. And obviously, if you have a cyber extortion incident, it would be covered by your cyber insurance policy.
Thank you. And I'd also like to just comment and mention also too, it's the retention, which is also known as a deductible. Those numbers Trevor just mentioned earlier, the $150 to $300 of ransom, you would have had to have paid your retention amount first. So as an example, if you bought a cyber insurance policy and it had a $1,000 retention and you were hit with this extortion, and they were asking for you to pay $300 before they released that key to decrypt your data and then be able to access your data, you would have had to have paid the retention first before any coverage is offered out. So if the extortion amount being requested was $2,000, well, you would have had coverage for that if it's a credible cyber extortion threat. But anything lower than $1,000, you would be responsible for determining whether or not you should pay it. Cyber terrorism is a really sensitive area right now, and many insurance carriers are not offering coverage within their policies for such incidents, but there is coverage available, with a handful of carriers. And if it's offered, what type of coverage is provided? We're providing coverage for income loss and interruption expenses, which means that your network is thrown offline potentially by a nation-state type of attack, and you start experiencing a revenue loss, being that you can't access your servers. So that would be the cyber terrorism piece. And again, it's something that isn't really being offered by that many insurance carriers. Doesn't mean it's not available, because there are carriers that are writing it, but not that many are offering this coverage today. And it is a very important piece. So if you're looking for this type of coverage, there's ways of working with an experienced broker to have the coverage written back, or looking for a carrier who does offer it.
Christine, I have a question related to cyber terrorism, or more correctly, hacktivism, where you have hackers who are not financially motivated, but have more of some sort of a big picture interest in seeing a particular type of business or industry being taken down. Say, for example, you had a manufacturer or a beef plant, processing beef, and you had a group of hacktivists who are anti-killing animals, and they hacked into the environment. Where would the coverage sort of fall into that in that scenario? Is that considered to be cyber terrorism, or is that fall into another category?
That would be questionable. There most likely would potentially be coverage for that type of incident, where it's not really motivated by the backing of a nation state. It would really be kind of hard to really prove, first of all, and to even locate that individual who started this in the first place. So potentially a claim would be submitted at that point, and coverage probably could be found. It probably wouldn't be deemed as a cyber terrorism piece, because again, that's kind of usually hard to really prove. So I'm thinking out loud that there would be coverage for that incident, because it's not being backed by a nation state, so it couldn't be deemed a cyber terrorism. It's not an act of terrorism per se. Now, the question we always get is, okay, the coverages, sound good, but what's not covered? And as it relates to first and third party coverages, these are some examples of what's not covered in the cyber insurance. So first would be collection of data without consumer knowledge. You're sort of collecting the information, selling it to third parties, not letting that data owner know. Well, that's not going to be covered. Spam, unsolicited email, faxes, text messages, mobile video messages, not covered. Intellectual property, as I mentioned earlier, patent infringement and trade secrets are not covered under cyber insurance. Unlicensed software, cyber insurance wouldn't be the coverage that would pay out. Blackouts, if something happens to critical infrastructure, the electric grid, and your company's offline, unless you're making your own power, your own electric, that type of incident wouldn't be covered. But if your internet service provider goes down, or your energy provider experiences a blackout, you wouldn't be able to submit a claim for the business interruption, which is the network interruption piece coverage. Conduct exclusion, typically directors and officers and those in the C-suite. If you're looking for them to be covered, you're probably going to want to have the directors and officers a D&O insurance policy in place to be able to protect them from the personal liability that they're sort of exposed when you're a company who might be publicly traded and you're looking at shareholders are expecting your board of directors to have the fiduciary obligation to protect the data. And if you don't have cyber insurance in place, a lot of shareholders today are then turning back to the board and pushing it on them. So typically not covered here under cyber insurance. Employee liability, which is employment practices liability, that would be covered elsewhere, not in a cyber insurance policy. Fund transfer exclusion. When we're talking about fund transfers, we're talking about that unauthorized company-owned bank account. The hacker is able to get access to your company's username and password and then does an unauthorized transfer to another country or anywhere. That's not covered here under cyber insurance. There's a handful of insurance carriers who will add that coverage in for very small sublimits. Not to say it's not available, because it is, but typically, unless you have coverage for that, it's not going to be covered. Repair, replacement, recalls, that's also excluded unless you're a technology service provider and you have a technology errors and omissions policy. There could be some coverage for that. Property damage, and when I'm talking about property damage, I'm talking about computers, the physical hardware. Not covered here. We're looking at intangible data. So that's what we're covering under cyber insurance. So we're not covering anything tangible, which would be the computer systems, the actual hardware. And terrorism. And as I mentioned, cyber terrorism could be found in some policies. And some considerations when you're looking to purchase a cyber insurance policy. Well, first off, you want to determine how much insurance is needed and how much risk your company can afford to take on. And perhaps you're an industry or a company who has attacks that happen multiple times every day, and you're able to perhaps cover some of that out of pocket, that you want to really ascertain and look at the different types of threats and vulnerabilities as they pertain to your company and ascertain how much you're able to self-insure and then how much you want to mitigate over to a cyber insurance policy. So sort of mitigating that risk. You want to review the types of coverages provided. You don't want to really buy a insurance policy off the shelf. What I mean about off the shelf is you just don't want to buy something without really looking at the coverages, looking at the conditions, the exclusions, because there's experienced brokers like myself who are able to navigate the available offerings. And if something is wrong in the wording of the contract or coverage needs to be written back, an experienced broker is able to work with the carriers to help make that happen. You want to know what triggers the policy. If there's a breach of perhaps, an unauthorized access to data, and you aren't legally obligated to report the breach, but you're concerned about that affected individual having the significant or potential financial identity theft, then that would be considered sort of a voluntary breach if you're not obligated to report it, deemed by privacy law. So you would probably want to check your policy to see if it's covering not only those breaches that you're obligated to report, but a voluntary data breach. Not every policy covers both, so you want to look at the wording and really know what triggers the policy. You want to know what the policy is excluding. Every policy has different exclusions, so you really want to look at that carefully. You don't want to find out when you're submitting a claim that something's excluded that you really thought was covered. And types of data covered, I went through that a little bit earlier, personally identifiable information and the personal health information. Some policies also cover corporate third-party data. So you really want to look at the wording of how data is described and worded. You want to question what response costs and services are covered in the event of a breach. Those breach costs that we looked at earlier and the list of coverages, sort of like the framework of what insurance carriers are offering today, that everyone has their own services that they provide. So you really want to look at that piece and question what's being offered. And find out if it's possible to select your own vendors and or counsel. A lot of insurance carriers today have lists of preferred vendors that they have already negotiated with to be able to work with. So it's typically a panel of preferred providers who are reputable, well-known experts in the industry who would be called upon to work on your claim and to respond to your breach. But if you have a particular vendor that you like working with or a particular attorney, then now's the time at the application to decide, who you want to name if you are already working with someone and have a pre-existing relationship, rather than at the time of your breach, because at that point, it's probably going to be too late to select who you want. So if you're looking to work with someone in particular, it's best to have them approved at the time of application. Cyber insurance is not a one-size-fits-all policy. Not every company has the same risks or liability exposures. The types of coverages offered by cyber insurance policies, as you can tell from my earlier slides, they're very greatly by insurance carrier. And you really want to work with an experienced and knowledgeable cyber insurance broker who can help your company navigate the various policies today and align the appropriate coverages with your company's cyber and data risks. So here, I think we're all familiar with what happened with Sony. And what happened with them is attackers wiped data from Sony's machines and rendered some of their internal networks inoperable. They had their emails were down for weeks. Nobody could communicate internally by email. Their network was thrown offline. Sony did have a cyber insurance policy, and we were able to see some of the leaked documents just because they were thrown out there online, and actually I was able to view that. So the coverages that were triggered in Sony's breach, they had security and privacy liability. They had to access the coverage for breach response. They had employee data that was exposed, crisis management. They were able to go and hire a public relations firm to help navigate the media. Of course, they had to hire a forensics investigator to determine the scope of the breach and help them get back online and operating internally. Sony could potentially face privacy, regulatory defense, and penalties at some point in the future. And network asset protection, they had a lot of their computer software and data was lost in this attack. So this type of attack wasn't really meant to steal data. It was really looking to harm Sony and throw them offline and to destroy their data, not steal it. We're seeing a lot of attacks based upon looking to destroy and not steal. Trevor, are you also seeing that out there where the attacks are really becoming not a matter of stealing data, but looking to destroy? In Sony's instance, that's what we're looking at. What are you seeing?
Well, we are seeing some of that occur, and these instances, like the Sony attack, tend to make headlines. But in reality, the criminal motive for stealing data and the number of instances for criminal motivation is much higher. So again, these cyber attacks, like cyber terrorism, like the Sony attack, some of the other things where we've seen hacktivists who are hacking into particular environments for some sort of social cause. Again, they're making headlines, but the vast majority we're seeing out there are more of the plain old criminal, cyber criminal looking for specific data that they can go and sell.
Thank you. Questions I always get is, well, how much does cyber insurance cost? The premiums do vary significantly by insurance carrier, so you definitely don't want to shop based upon cost. You get what you pay for today, so question what's covered and what's not. And when comparing policies, you want to compare coverages and not price. So that when you're looking at the proposals, don't look at the price first. You really need to do an apples-to-apples comparison of the coverages that are being offered, and then look at the price, and then sort of see what you can cut back on. Perhaps you increase the deductible. Perhaps you don't need some of the particular coverages as it pertains to your company. So keep cost off the table when you're looking at the proposals, and really look at the coverages and then work within your budget. Premiums are factored on a company's industry. So for instance, if you're in the healthcare or education industry, you're going to be paying a little bit of a higher premium than other industries that might have lower risk. Premium will be factored on your services, what you're providing. The types of data risks and exposures, we're going to look at what types of data you're collecting, storing, or processing, or perhaps have access to. And of course, computer security, privacy, and controls, policies and procedures. We're going to want to know what we like to call in the industry, what you're doing to maintain and practice good cyber hygiene. And in a few minutes, I'll let Trevor kind of take that and talk a little bit about cyber hygiene and why it's so important. But we need to make sure that you're practicing good habits as it pertains to security, because we're going to want to look at your privacy policies, your security policies, procedures, and controls, and factor that into the premium. And your gross revenue is also looked upon, and also we're going to want to know if you've had any losses in the past. And when I talk about losses, not any insurance claims, but have you been the victim of a data breach, security attack? We want to know those types of things. And here are some examples. I have these also posted on my website. You can go to that link there at the bottom. But these are actual clients who I've helped secure cyber insurance. And what, if you're in the healthcare or technology industry, kind of gives you a picture of some estimates of what you could potentially pay for a cyber insurance policy. Trevor, did you just want to touch on briefly cyber hygiene, of what I mean by cyber hygiene?
Sure, Mike, we can touch on that. Just as a reminder, if any of the folks who are on the webinar today and want to submit questions, the next couple minutes we'll be doing a Q&A session as well. So if you've got questions, please send them to the presenters. As far as cyber hygiene goes, I mean, this is, going back to very basics. Pretty much start off with doing something like a risk assessment, and then through that process, identify where your vulnerabilities are. Good cyber hygiene starts off with good policies and procedures. And if your employees know what to do, then they can practice those policies and procedures. If you don't have them documented, they become sort of just tribal knowledge. Then you start interjecting all sorts of weird and wonderful different ways of doing things. And some of them are both based on folklore and not necessarily good business practice or good IT security practice. And then once you have your policies and procedures, it's a matter of going and creating what's called multi-layered security, which is having multiple methods of protecting the environment, sort of like an onion, so that if one layer gets penetrated, there's something else, protecting the next layer down. And that's sort of a typical process you'd go through, and then identify where all those weak points are and build your strategy. We alluded to in the beginning, there's no such thing as a perfectly secure network, just like there's no such thing as a perfectly secure safe. There's always going to be some sort of level of vulnerabilities. It just becomes a question of balancing the risk and reward scenario. What is it going to cost you to implement good security practices, and then what you can't at a reasonable price, and what you can't mitigate through that, look to the cyber insurance to cover that gap.
Thank you, Trevor. Okay, if you do have a question, we welcome you to type your question in the chat box right now, and either Trevor or myself will answer it. So
Christine, I have one of the questions here, and this is a question for you. And the first question is: are there specific types of companies that need cyber insurance?
Yes, I think if your company, first of all, we're all interconnected today, and all are conducting our business in some kind of a digital way. So right there off the bat, you could be exposed to cyber risk. And especially if you're a company that is storing data, collecting it, processing it, you should explore cyber insurance. Or even if you don't have your own data and you're just accessing another organization's network, you still have that connection to their network, and you could potentially have your system affected and then sort of infect that other organization that you're working with through that connection. So I think regardless of, what kind of company you are, most companies today do and should explore, cyber insurance due to all of us having some kind of cyber risk. And Trevor, I have a question for you as well that just came in. How does cyber insurance come into play with your clients?
Thanks for the question. Well, what we see that there are two areas where cyber insurance comes into play. The first one is where we have clients who recognize that it's impossible to completely eliminate risk, and they're looking to have, obviously, as the adequate controls in place, and then use cyber insurance to mitigate that gap. And the other area where we see that coming into play is where they're trying to mitigate trying to meet a specific regulatory requirements, or they're trying to win a new piece of business, and there's a requirement to have cyber insurance in place as well. So having good cyber insurance often is part of RFP response now, and needs to be part of the organization's built into their organization's cost in order for them to do business.
Sure, and I'm seeing a lot of that too, especially for smaller companies being required by contract to purchase the cyber insurance. And a lot of companies today, a lot of startup companies will right off before they even open up the doors, they have cyber insurance in place just because it kind of gives them a competitive advantage, and they're telling their customers that, they're insured in the event of, a cyber incident, and that they're able to respond and make sure that they're taking care of their customers. And even if they're not working directly with consumers, that third-party company is requiring them, to purchase cyber insurance. So it's competitive advantage, I think, too. We're seeing a lot of that. And I have another one here, Trevor. What strategies would you recommend to companies to prevent data breaches?
Well, that's an easy one. Start off with a cyber risk assessment, as we mentioned before, and then use that cyber risk assessment to identify what your gaps are, get a list of recommendations as part of that process, and then develop your remediation plan. And then remediation often includes, implementing security policies and procedures, providing security monitoring. That could be done with a third party, or looking at vulnerability scanning, doing secure log management, file integrity monitoring, periodic penetration testing. Those are all sort of the gamut of things. One thing that's very important, and as part of that strategy, is the log management piece. And log management is primarily there to help you in the event of a data breach. So it's part of, in effect, your sort of insurance policy against a breach, because without having proper log data, it's extremely difficult to actually do a forensic investigation, and can end up costing a lot more money than it needs to. I gave the example earlier in the presentation. So we have another question here, and we've just got a couple more minutes left. This one for you, Christine, is, once a company has determined that they need cyber insurance, what's the next step?
The next step would be working with a broker who has experience of the types of policies out there, because they really do vary greatly by carrier. So an experienced broker who has worked in the industry and who's writing these policies is the best one to reach out to, just because it can help align your risks with the types of coverages you need. This often means bypassing your typical insurance agent that you're working with, just because oftentimes a lot of my clients come to me, because I specialize in cyber insurance. So I will say keep your existing insurance with your current agent, and we'll assist you with your cyber insurance coverages, because the policies are very complex today, and we've taken the time to really examine many different policy forms and know how to help our clients. And as I mentioned when I first introduced myself, we save our clients time, stress, and headaches just because we have the experience to be able to help. So the next step would be, again, working with an experienced broker who has the ability to approach carriers who they know, specialize in your industry, or who knows how to offer the right coverages for your needs, so that at the time of claim, you're not worrying about whether the claim is going to be covered or denied. You know right off the start what you're having as far as in coverages in your policy and how a claim will be handled, the types of response services that will be there for you at the time of a breach.
Well, great. Well, thank you, Christine. It looks like we're just about done in terms of time. So from TrustNet, I would like to thank everyone for attending the webinar. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. We've got our web address on the slide presentation, and there's my personal email address and phone number if you wish to contact us. I'd also like to thank Christine for her participation in the webinar. We appreciate it. I think it's been extremely valuable and had some really great insights into cyber insurance. I certainly learned a lot. I want to thank you, Christine, for partnering up with TrustNet to present the webinar.
My pleasure, and thank you very much.
Okay, folks. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.